Welcome, welcome all. We're so thrilled to have an evening with Pico Iyer. We started a conversation about 5 months ago in a kind of a noisy restaurant in Nara, Japan. John T. and Allison and myself and several others were there, and I'm so excited to have Pico here where we can continue the conversation about many things, and particularly about his writing and about his latest book called The Half-Known Life. As you know, Pico has written something like 16 books and many articles, and is very well known across many genres for his very insightful, I would say, some people call it travel writing. I don't think it's travel writing. I think it's something deeper. It's like searching for something in foreign places, writing, if you will. And we're very thrilled to have you, Pico. So thank you for coming, speaking from Japan, Nara, your home.
Thank you, John. I am delighted to be here. I've never been called a luminary before, and I haven't often been associated with Zen, so this is a triumph for me already.
Well, we'll get you a little badge, and you'll be carved into a wall, and we'll take care of you.
No, and I'm sitting here in the early autumn with the golden light of morning flooding in, so I couldn't be happier to be talking across the ocean.
Lovely. They call it Bumiji, right? The red leaves of
Yes.
autumn.
Yes.
Yeah.
Joyful
Well,
participation in a world of sorrows.
well, Pico, you got a very fascinating background. You're born in Oxford. Your parents were academics, trained at Oxford there, and then they brought you out to Santa Barbara, and you would go back and forth for many years, where you went to boarding school, and then you went to Oxford yourself and graduated from Harvard, and then in fact joined Time Magazine, which is the epitome of corporate journalism. There's no better place to work than Time Magazine in its heyday when you were there, and you gave it all up, which I think is really fascinating. And why did you do that?
I was in my late 20s. I had no dependents, and I had always really been moved by Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, saying that he didn't want to die feeling he'd never lived. And I thought that I was having such a good time in New York City. As you say, Time Magazine was a stimulating place to be. I could easily never be able to tell how deep the goodness went, and wake up and find I was 70 years old and realize I'd never explored any other options. So I thought the perfect complement to this high-paced go-go life in the middle of Midtown Manhattan would be a temple in Japan. So I left with the intention of spending a year in a monastery in Kyoto. And although it only lasted a week, because a monastery in Kyoto was not the romantic place I had imagined on 6th Avenue and 50th Street. Here I am 35 years later. And so whatever intuition brought me here was the correct one, but it took me a while to mature into it.
Yeah, I understand that you had only a single interview with the teacher Fukushima Roshi at Tofukuji, right?
Yes, in which he probably passed on, as Zen teachers are meant to do, the most important wisdom, which was that the monastic tradition is not about getting away from the world, but coming back into it with clarity and direction. And I also remember very soon after I came to Kyoto, I heard this wonderful sentence about how it's easy to sit still in the Zendo. The trick is to sit still in the middle of the world. And you know, because you've had such a long, deep Zen practice, it's not easy to sit still in the Zendo. But nonetheless, you also know, because you've had such a deep Zen practice, that the point of sitting still in the Zendo is to be able to sit still in Times Square on New Year's Eve, and to bring that kind of clarity and undistractedness to the madness of the world. So although I didn't last long in the monastery, I was glad to have these pointers that refined my understanding of what a monastery really is meant to be about.
Now, you're best friends with many Buddhists. You know the Dalai Lama very well, His Holiness, and hopefully we'll touch on that later. You were born a Hindu. You've spent 100 retreats in a Catholic monastery, and yet you're none of these.
None of these. I'm a typical mixed up global mongrel. And the beauty of my life, growing up in at least 4 traditions, is that, as you say, I've been exposed to the wisdoms of many different places: Japan, England, California, and India. The challenge is I have to find exactly where I stand, and not just mix them all together in the sort of salad bar form of contemplativeness, and say, I'll take a little bit of Sufism and mix it in with the cloud of unknowing, and bring in IQ too. So as I say, it's the blessing and the curse of the modern world that most of us are made up of so many different places.
Well, I thought maybe you could start your own religion because, Christ was not a Christian, that argument. So what do you want to call your religion once you've passed on? Picoism or Picoian? Yeah.
No, I mean, I want to eliminate Pico as much as possible from the picture in the equation. When I was a kid, I would say transcendentalism really spoke to me. Now, now I would say that although, as you said, I'm a wandering journalist and I don't really have a spiritual life as such, or a spiritual direction, silence is my great teacher, because I feel that silence brooks no arguments, and that silence is non-denominational. And somehow I find the silence speaks to me much more deeply than any scripture or doctrine could. And I like the fact, whether it's on an individual level or whether you're on a silent retreat, that words are what pull us apart, and silence is what really brings us together. And so at a time when the world seems more divided than ever, I feel the call to silence principally. So I don't know what the name for a religion based on silence would be. Maybe it would be Quakerism, though I've never been to a Quaker meeting house. But silence and light, I suppose, are my teachers.
Yeah, that's nice. In fact, you wrote a book on stillness, didn't you?
Yes, that wasn't my choice, but the people at TED Talks intuited this hunger across the world as the world accelerates for stillness and clarity. And because I travel a lot, they rather perversely asked me to write a book about going nowhere. And a lot of people responded to that book because I think we're all longing to find an anchor as the world moves around us ever more speedily.
The half-known life comes from a quote by Melville. And he says, in the soul of man there lies one insular Tahiti full of peace and joy, but encompassing by all the horrors of the half-known life. What is the half-known life to you?
To me, it has at least 2 meanings. On the very superficial level, I feel that in this age of information, we know less about the rest of the world than ever before, and that we know least of all about the countries we hear most about: Iran, Cuba, North Korea. We know something about their leaders or their nuclear policies, but painfully little about daily life and human reality there. But at a much deeper level, I feel that the really important moments in all our lives are ones we can never begin to explain away. Suddenly we fall in love. Suddenly a fire destroys our house. Suddenly a pandemic stops the world. And our lives are really determined, I feel, by what we do with what we can't understand. And it also goes back to what I was just saying about the world feeling so painfully divided, and our nations and communities too. And I think that division often arises from the fact that I might say, I know more or better than you, John. And you will say, no, Pico, I know the real facts. And the pretense to knowledge is worse than ignorance. And our claims to knowledge are what take us in different directions. But it's the vastness of all the things that we don't know, faith, love, wonder, terror, that really unite us. And I know your friend and colleague John Tarrant has expressed the Zen wisdom about not knowing being a form of intimacy. And I also see not knowing as a form of humility, a form of liberation, and as I say, a form of unity. Because the older I get, the more I see I'm not a master of any universe, I'm a servant of the universe. And it's as if I'm in a little tent high up in the Himalayas. There's this vast darkness and there's the outline of the silver peaks. And I'm in a tent with a little lantern. And really everything I don't know is far vaster, as well as far more important than the little that I can know and see. And it's interesting. So I actually disagree with Melville, because Melville was always looking for answers in a world that I think is about living with answerlessness. And so he was always trying to unriddle the relation, the nature of evil, and where is God in the equation, and where is the devil? And so he was asking questions and plunging into the deep and coming up so disappointed that finally he lost his mind, and he spent 30 years walking through the streets of New York, forgotten and literally rudderless. And so I think that really what we need to do is not presume or hope to understand most of what's going on with us, but to make our lives in the midst of everything we can't control, we can't anticipate, and we can't comprehend.
In the book, in a way, you and I were talking, it's not really conflict tourism, but you're going to places that are in conflict. You're in Sri Lanka and you're having breakfast, and 2 days later, a journalist is killed. And the day before, somebody was blown up. And, and this is the case in many of the examples throughout the book. And you said a really interesting thing, particularly about Sri Lanka, is that it used to be such a paradise, and now it's such a hell, really. And we have friends who live there, and one of those people may be on this call. But you weren't interested in a Fodor style paradise, that you wanted to find paradise within essentially darkness.
Well, I think it's our notions of paradise that get in the way of our seeing it. And I'm not sure Sri Lanka ever was a paradise, because I think so often that's a projection. So you're absolutely right. The book is about cutting through one illusion or projection of an external paradise after another. And so, if you're on a wonderful golden beach on a sunny day, you may think this is heaven, but within 12 hours, the night's going to fall. And if it's truly a wonderful beach, the next day it's going to be very crowded. So I've always felt that the only paradise I could trust is one I would find in the middle of the real world and in the face of death. And I was writing this book during the pandemic when that became, acutely clear to all of us, that the whole world was in the state of uncertainty and grief in many cases. And yet that need not preclude the possibility of finding wonder and joy and beauty right here, right now. And I'm sure many of the people listening to this call found themselves stuck at home, walking down the neighborhood and realizing that their neighborhood had treasures and beauties as great as any they would travel across the world to find. Funnily enough, I was reading my old friend Thomas Merton this morning, and literally an hour ago, I read him say to a friend, our job is to find paradise in the middle of purgatory. And he said, I almost said our job is to find paradise in the middle of hell. So yes, you're absolutely right. I was going through war zones and places of conflict, Sri Lanka, Kashmir, Jerusalem, and several others, precisely to say that if I found something true and deep and abiding in the midst of that, it's something I could hold to more than if I found it on a beach in Tahiti or the Seychelles. And I've been lucky enough to go to those golden idylls, but also to find that they're paradise for the short-time visitor and very real life and hard work for the people who are laboring round the clock to make us visitors comfortable. And of course, the tragedy of the world, which we all experience constantly, is that your paradise can never be mine. That's the story of Jerusalem in some ways. Not just that the three children of Abraham are divided, even though they're drawing from the same scriptures and stories, but even within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, shared by 6 Christian orders, if the Franciscans walk 1 meter into the Greek Orthodox area, they start going after one another with brooms. In other words, their reading of the same scripture from the same teacher is so radically different. So I suppose I also feel that I don't trust a paradise that's exclusive. And the only paradise I could happily live with is one that is open to all. And I should probably say, and as an asterisk, that I think the copy of the book you have, the US edition, has a subtitle called In Search of Paradise. And it was decided that would be an attempting a subtitle, but it's actually a very inappropriate one. And the one I had chosen, which is on the British edition, is Finding Paradise in a Divided World, which really speaks to your question. The world is always going to be difficult. The nature of the world is sickness, old age, and death. And how do we find paradise in the midst of those limitations and challenges?
Just a little sidebar with regard to your trip to Iran, which was the opening chapter of the book. It was very moving, where you went in, possibly against the rules, into a mosque with your guide, and he was just crying, and people were crying. It was very
Yes.
emotional for you. But I thought it was great. You talked about Hafez, and how when he died. Could you tell that story about the people who are trying to decide whether he should go to heaven or hell?
To be honest, you probably remember the details better than I do, John.
Well, let me read, because it's really worth it. Hafez's poems of drunkenness and love had always been impeccably double-edged, but when the holy men deliberated over whether his dead body uh, should go on, they couldn't decide whether he should go to heaven or hell. So they took one of his books and they opened it up to a place, and it says, even though this man has lived like he'd be in hell, he should go to heaven. It was really a very good story.
And it's all, also arbitrary. Today, I will probably travel through many heavens and a few hells, and every one of us the same. So I'd be glad almost if we can eliminate or free ourselves from those ideas.
I'd like to touch on your creativity, your notion of creativity, or where does the writing come from? You were talking to a friend once, and you said, "Well, my writing comes out of the blue," and your friend asked, "Well, what is the blue?"
Yeah. Isn't that wonderful? I mean, I know you're all involved in koan study, and koan is probably about the embrace of the fact that we can never know very much and never try to answer very much. And so, yes, I mean, creativity is probably the half-known life, because as I practice it as a writer, it just involves sitting and sitting and sitting day after day, month after month, in the hope that now and then something wiser and deeper than I ever could be will speak through me, and something will come out of me that was never even inside me. And it's a very hard process, as you know, because I know you were a journalist for many years, to surrender any notions of logic and control, and just see that your hope is to produce something that's much deeper than you are. And so, for example, probably the best practical form my creativity takes is taking 2 walks every day. And that's an important part of my writing practice, because so long as I'm at my desk, I'm hunched over my notes, I'm hemmed in by the notion of trying to make some kind of linear outline. I'm basically only as rich as my little ideas. And as soon as I walk away from the desk, I'm taking in the turning maple leaves and the radiant blue sky, and anything can come in on me, and including things that I never would have thought to think, as it were. And so it's actually by taking myself away from my ideas, my project, my desk, that maybe I can be most receptive to something outside me, and therefore that will form the best kind of outcome. And I remember when I was very young, I thought that creativity as a writer meant flooding the page with as many ideas and thoughts and feelings as possible. And the longer I've done it, the more I found it's really about subtraction. It's about taking away as much as possible, so that you're left with the classic Japanese empty room. And when you step into the room, there's only one thing there. There's a single vase. And by bringing all of yourself to that vase, you find everything you want and much more. So 50 minus 49 suddenly becomes 101, as it were. And the other thing that I didn't understand when I began writing all those years ago was at that time I thought creativity is about getting something out of nothing. Then I remembered the sound of music. Nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever could. And I realized that more often creativity maybe is about bringing together two relatively well-known things, and by bringing them into conspiracy or collision, producing something unexpected. All of us here know something about the founding fathers and early American history. All of us here have heard hip hop, but bring them together and suddenly you have that miracle called Hamilton. And I remember actually the very first chapter of my first book, while I was working at Time Magazine in my mid-20s, I took my first trip to Bali. And as I began walking around Bali, I thought, this really reminds me of Prospero's island, maybe because I had been teaching Shakespeare immediately before I started working on World Affairs and Time magazine. So I went back to The Tempest and I read through it. And then I read Bali through the eyes of Shakespeare's plays, this island flooded with spirits, angels, and devils, as well as drunken exiles from Milan. And I thought, for 400 years, people have been talking about Shakespeare, and nearly all of them know much more than I do. And for many generations, foreigners have been writing about Bali, and they're much more intimate than I ever could be. But not so many people have thought of bringing Shakespeare and Bali together. And in my own little way, by bringing these two disparate worlds together, maybe I can create something that's not so familiar.
I see. Yeah, yeah. And you bought a mask in Bali and you took it home, and there was something, some energy in it, or something that you had to take it off the wall. You couldn't keep it up.
Thank you. Exactly. I mean, it's a reminder. Paradise is the place with a serpent in it. Paradise is the place with which, if it's full of angels, is full of devils too. That it's the light and the shadow and the mingling of the two that we have to live among, rather than eternal sunshine. So exactly right. As I remember walking down the street in the surface town of Kuta in Bali, 1984. And in those days, it was mostly open-fronted shacks selling masks. They were very, very scary masks. They were deities, demons, gods, much too frightening for me to come close to. But there was this one, as you said, yellow, red, and green mask of an owl, and it seemed very innocuous, like a child's toy. And so I thought, oh, this is the perfect thing to take back to New York City. So I was so happy to take this little piece of Bali back to my little apartment on Park and 20th. And as you said, as soon as I arrived, I put it on the wall. And within 5 seconds, I had to tear it down and put it away where I'd never look at it again, which is a reminder also that something intrinsic to a very charged network such as Bali can't be taken simply to Midtown Manhattan. And it was also a humbling reminder that in this Garden of Eden, or this paradise that I thought I had found in Bali, I was completely out of my depth. I couldn't read the signs, and I couldn't begin to measure the weight or the significance of everything around me. And so I was taking loaded explosives back to New York, even though I thought it was just a child's mask. And no, I'm not so, I've never been so interested in travel, but one of the good things travel teaches you is how little you know about anywhere, starting with your own home, and the care and attention that you have to bring to the world accordingly, because you're dealing with things that you can't begin to comprehend.
Yeah, yeah. 1990 was a big year for you. You were just coming up as a writer, and a little more on the creativity side. A fire swept through that Santa
Mm.
Barbara area where your mother's home was, and you had been so used to, in our conversation, it seemed, as a previous journalist, freshly from that experience, to your notebooks and to all the details in your notebooks. And you later told me that you learned through that fire, when you lost all of your notebooks, you lost everything. In fact, you couldn't even grab your passport, which was 5 feet away, if you were to save your life. And yet, it was one of the best experiences for you as a writer.
Yes, as you know, it took my editor to point out when I said, I'm sorry, I can't deliver the next 3 books I've promised for the next 8 years because all my notes are ash now. He said, well, that's a shame, but it's a liberation. And that you're one kind of writer when you're working from your notes, and you'll be a much deeper writer if you close your eyes and work from heart, memory, and imagination. And so I still take voluminous notes, but when I'm writing my books, I keep the notes on the far side of the room, and I try to work from something inside myself. And then if I need to know whether it was a willow tree or a sycamore tree or a green car or a blue car, I can turn to my notes, but they're not guiding me. I'm hoping, again, as you say, in terms of creativity, that something more intangible is guiding me. And I think also the blessing of suddenly losing my house like that and losing everything I had in the world was a reminder of actually the line I had learned when I was reading Shakespeare from Hamlet. There's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And that this seeming calamity was by no means only a bad experience. First, as you said, it liberated me to write differently. And in fact, I'd always been too shy or scared to write fiction as a journalist, but I had no notes now. I was still possessed by Cuba, which is the place I was spending time in then. So I thought I have to come at it imaginatively through fiction, through made up characters and a story. And of course, as with many people, when you lose everything in the world like that, when the insurance company very kindly came to me and said, we'll replace all your possessions, I realized I didn't need 90% of the books and the clothes and the furniture I'd acquired. I could actually live much more the way I'd always hoped to live, much more lightly on the ground. And maybe the most important liberation at that point was to see that now that my physical home and family home in Santa Barbara was gone, I could really give myself fully to the place that felt like the home of my heart and my soul, which is Japan, and really move much more entirely across the Pacific to the place that spoke to me and that seemed familiar before I had ever seen it. And I remember, as you say, I was working for Time magazine then, and the night of the fire, soon I was stuck in the middle of the fire, surrounded by 70-foot flames for 3 hours. Finally, a fire truck was able to get to me and tell me I was free to drive down to the town. So I drove down the mountain past these, shattered buildings and smoking cars. And I went straight to a supermarket and I bought a toothbrush, which was then the only thing I had in the world. And then I went to a friend's house to sleep on the floor. But you know how a journalistic's mind works. I had just had a front seat view on what was then the worst fire in Californian history. And so as soon as I got to my friend's house, I went to a computer and I filed a report on it for my bosses at Time magazine. And so in that account of the forest fire that had just wiped out 450 houses, almost the second of which was mine, I ended the piece with a little poem that I picked up in Japan from the 17th century, I think quite well known, in which I believe Masahide wrote, "My house burnt down, now I can see better the rising moon." So even the night of the fire, something in me sensed this wasn't entirely a bad thing, and that actually it would give me a much clearer view on my priorities, what really matters. Because sometimes amidst all the clutter and distractions of the world, I find it very hard to sift the trivial from the essential. Stripped of all my possessions, I knew what was important. And I also knew what hitherto had survived the fire, which is my mother, my wife-to-be, my favorite Van Morrison song, my favorite Graham Greene novel.
Yeah. And also you sought refuge in the Big Sur area at the Benedictine monastery. And it wasn't long after that fire that you first went up there. And you've been there many, many times since. Could you read
Yes.
us your first experience of just going up there? Having, I don't know how close after the fire it was. Was it days or was it months after the fire?
It was months, and I would say it's not a causal relation that I
Hmm.
lost everything in the house and I found my way to the monastery, but it is an oblique one because right after the fire, for many months, I was sleeping on the floor in that friend's house. And another friend came in, said, "Look, if you're sleeping on the floor, why don't you go up to this retreat place? It's 3.5 hours to the north. And there you'll have a desk, a lovely room, beautiful ocean views, absolute silence, hot showers nearby, food put out in the communal kitchen, and it's only $30 a night at that time. So you'd probably be better off there than sleeping on this floor." And I had grown up, as you were mentioning at the beginning, in Anglican England, where we had to go to chapel every morning and every evening. So I'd had all the crosses and hymnals I needed in the world. And the last thing I wanted to do was to go to a Catholic hermitage, but I thought it was better than sleeping on the floor. And so I think the piece you'd like me to read out is actually from an interview I gave on the radio some years ago, but somebody asked
Yes.
me about going there. And so I said to her, "I had a lot of movement in my life, but not enough stillness. When my house burnt down, a friend suggested I go to a Benedictine hermitage. I got out of the car at the monastery, and the air was pulsing. Somehow, almost immediately, it was as if a huge heaviness fell away from me, and the lens cap came off from my eyes. Suddenly, I was seeing everything with great immediacy, and it was almost as if little Pico had disappeared and the whole world had come in on me instead. I remember a blue jay suddenly alighted on the fence outside my window, and I watched it rapt as if it was the most miraculous thing that had happened. Then bells began ringing above, and it felt as if they were ringing inside of me. When darkness fell, I just walked along the monastery road under the stars, watching the taillights of cars disappear around the headlands to the south. And really, almost instantaneously, I felt I'd stepped into a richer, deeper life, a real life that I had half forgotten had existed.
It's
And you
lovely.
mentioned,
Yeah.
yeah, thank you. You mentioned before that that I've been there more than 100 times over 32 years now. And the small miracle is all these years later, half a lifetime later, when I might be inured to the power and liberation of that silence, I still feel that. I was there 10 weeks ago, probably, and I stepped into my little cell, and before I knew it, I was writing, pure joy. But I think, so I won't go on endlessly about this. Maybe I'll just say two things. One
It's
is,
okay if you'd like to.
well, one reason I won't go on endlessly is I've completed my next book, which is about these 32 years, which will be coming out in January 2025. So anyone who has more interest can read that book, which is going to be called A Flame. But that the two things I'll say, the practical thing is these monks, Benedictine monks in Big Sur, California, belong to the Camaldolese order, which is the single most contemplative order within Catholicism, that was actually given a dispensation by the Vatican to engage with and learn from other traditions. So my Catholic friends are always going over the mountain to engage with the Tassajara monks and the Zen center there. They have a Hindu ashram in southern India. And when you open the little pamphlet in each room explaining what the place is about, on the very first page, they say, well, of course, the Buddha was the father of monasticism, and the Rig Veda is what is laying down the foundations for the life that we recognize here. And so they're much more, their mandate is to be open to everybody, and certainly not to impose any doctrine on anyone. But I think the other important thing coming out of the passage I just read is that it's not difficult to feel absolutely radiant and free when you're sitting in a little sun-washed room
Right.
over the Pacific Ocean in Big Sur, which already is a place where cares seem left behind and is out of time. And so initially, what I gloried in there was the solitude and the beauty and the silence, my great teacher, as I say. But over the years, I've come more and more to see that the point of being in that place, and I'm sorry to say this because all of you as Zen practitioners know this much better than I do, but the point of being in such a place is to learn about community and compassion or service, obedience, as they call it. And so over the 32 years I've been there, what's really most moved me and probably left its most profound mark on me is watching the monks and the many people from every background at all who come there giving themselves to others. And I remember actually just after the pandemic began, the prior of that monastery sent round a message to all his friends. And he said, please remember, the best cure for anxiety is taking care of others. And we all know that. It's sort of obvious, but it's so easy to forget, especially at a time of some drama. And I think at the dawn of the pandemic, a lot of people were feeling unsettled and anxious, very fearful. I was wondering what's going to happen to my 88-year-old mother who's just been in hospital? What's going to happen to me and my wife, where in our 60s we suffer from asthma? And it's easy to get caught up in one's own little dramas. And such a wonderful thing suddenly to be reminded that, for example, the frontline workers at that time were not in a state of anxiety. They were in a state of action. They were tending to people. They were trying to keep people away from death and suffering. And that my thinking and fearing was a kind of indulgence. But it took my Benedictine prior friend just to free me from that and remind me, if you're really worried, look out for everybody around you.
Yeah, yeah. Love to touch on that in a minute, where the Catholics are so good at helping people. Here's some food, boom. And the Buddhists are really doctors. But isn't
No.
isn't that the very message of this book? Is taking whatever you found in that Benedictine monastery out into conflict zones, and by extension, if if I understood the prior right, identifying, bringing that into the conflict zones of even of our own heart. Isn't that what the book's about?
Oh, beautiful, beautiful, John. That, I mean, that's far better than I could put it. But you're absolutely right. I love the conflict zones of the heart, and you know, as I have found on retreat, that part of the beauty of retreat is what comes up is the shadows and the difficult stuff, and you can't run away from it when you're in a zendo or when you're in a cell. And I'm really grateful for that, because I would much rather confront the dark spaces in myself and the dark spaces in the world in a cell or in a zendo than in the middle of driving down a freeway or in the middle of the chaos of the world. But you're absolutely right. And so indeed, I mean, these two books are really companion pieces, like brother and sister. And the first book that you just read is about crisscrossing the globe and cutting through the illusion of paradise in many different places and finding it only in the middle of the turmoil. And this book I'm about to bring out is, as you say, about people who've chosen really never to leave their cloister and to find everything they need within, and therefore to bring that out to the people in need. And I loved what you said about Buddhism and Catholicism. You mentioned how I've been lucky enough to spend a lot of time with the Dalai Lama. And I remember many years ago, he said to me, hedging it in with cautions and qualifications, because he's such a precise speaker, that to some extent he felt the Tibetan monks, being secluded from the world on top of the mountains with very little access to anybody else for many centuries, had had the chance really to refine meditation in a way that was less familiar in the West. But he said he felt that the Catholic monks had a lot to teach the Tibetan monks when it came to dealing with the suffering in the world, that the Buddhists are great with suffering in the mind, as you said, they're doctors of the mind, but the Catholics are so good at going out onto the street corners and to the Haitis of the world and offering succor, almost like a médecin sans frontières. And I was touched that he said that he was counseling his Tibetan monks please to learn that part from their Catholic brothers, even as their Catholic brothers are learning from their Tibetan and Japanese friends. And I love the fact you're reading your newsletter, John, to hear about how your teacher, Yamada Roshi, had so many Catholic students. And it's always been my experience that the deeper anybody is in any tradition, the more he or she is open to every other tradition. And so, as you saw, the center of my book about the half-known life, really two figures, the Dalai Lama and Thomas Merton. And one thing that moves me about the Dalai Lama is that he will go and give long talks on the Gospels, and tears will come to his eyes when he's talking about Jesus. And what moved me about Thomas Merton was here a Trappist monk for 27 years would find what he felt was his great realization from looking at some Buddhas in Sri Lanka. So in a divided world, I'm very inspired by people who can look across the wall.
And you mentioned that Thomas Merton died 4 days after that, and in a way, his life was then, but complete. In a way.
Yes,
right?
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And that was the culmination of the trip that he made to seek out the wisdom of the East, where he met the Dalai Lama 3 times and various other Tibetan teachers. And you're exactly right. He sensed, and he was confirmed in the sense, that his 27 years of intense Catholic study had to be rounded out with encounters with Buddhism and the other traditions of Asia.
I'm really fascinated by the global universal appeal that Dalai Lama is able to engender. And you sort of mentioned it, but why is he so appealing to so many people?
Because he always looks for the place of commonality. And because, one thing that moves me is that as a Tibetan, he begins his day by praying for the Chinese, who arguably are helping to destroy Tibet. That as a Buddhist, he'll come to California and tell audiences, please don't become a Buddhist in most circumstances. Stay within your own traditions where your roots are deepest and there's the least danger of misunderstanding, generally speaking. And as a religious figure, and one of the most cherished religious figures in the world, he brings out a book called Beyond Religion, precisely because he's had a front seat view on the way in which religion, which is meant to unite us, tears us apart in places like Belfast or Sri Lanka or Jerusalem. So he's so wonderfully unattached to his own positions. and so non-denominational in that sense. And as you know, in 10 different Novembers when he came to Japan, my wife and I got to travel with him, and we were with him for 8 hours of his day by his side every day as he traveled across Japan. And we'd go shopping in a crowded 5-story Yokohama shopping mall. And as we were riding in the elevator, he would be rubbing the elevator operator's arm, up and down warmly as if they were oldest friends. When we would be driving across the country, we'd stop on a freeway at a little 7-Eleven, and he would go and buy us little cans of hot tea, which you will remember from your time in Japan. And then he'd just stand at the door of the convenience store, greeting every bewildered truck driver who came in. And his gift for bringing himself off the throne, as it were, demystifying himself and reminding us that he's just a human, the same as us, with the same sorrows, the same hopes, the same frustrations. It's an unusual gift for a religious leader to do that. And he's brought democracy literally to his people by deposing himself as a political leader, but in a much deeper way, he's democratic with everybody he meets. And one thing that would always strike us, every morning we'd go into his hotel room at 8:30 in the morning when his official day began, and we'd see two things. The first would be a well-worn copy of the day's newspapers, because he really keeps up closely with what's happening across the globe. And the other would be a telescope, because he knew that wherever he went on his global travels, each place would offer a different angle on the world, a different way of looking at the heavens. So he never would take anything for granted, and he would be traveling really as a student as much as a teacher. And then we'd go with him down in an elevator to the lobby. And of course, the word would have gotten around that the Dalai Lama's in town. So hundreds of people would be gathered there with requests, with scarves, with cameras, whatever. And a little 4-year-old girl would come up to him with a question. And he would listen to that 4-year-old girl as if he were listening to the Buddha, absolutely give himself to her. This answers the question of how he makes contact with everybody, regardless of age or background. And then the very next day, he'd be talking to a large audience in Tokyo, and he would be talking about what he'd learned from this 4-year-old girl. And probably the people in the crowd would, oh, this is just part of his stump speech, is what he says at every tour. But we, having been next to him, saw it was literally coming out of the encounter of that's 36 hours earlier. And he was still trying to process and get what he could from what the young woman had told him. And so I think that blend of humility and absolute openness is part of what has made him really a friend to the world.
And as you sort of mentioned, he's also very practical. You say that at many of these meetings, somebody will stand up and they'll say, I have such disappointed dreams that global warming is not reversing. We don't yet have peace in Palestine.
Yes.
My dreams have been crashed. And he said, wrong dreams.
Yes. He always stresses you have to be very, very realistic and rigorous in your assessment of what is possible and what is impossible. And if you're committing yourself to too great a dream, you're certain to be disappointed. And the way I often translate it to myself is that if you dream of being with Brad Pitt or Angelina Jolie tomorrow, it ain't going to happen. But if you dream of finding in your partner qualities that Brad Pitt or Angelina would envy, that will happen right now in many, many different forms. And he's very good at saying, I don't know, to go back to where we began this conversation. People often ask him about raising children, and he'll fall back and laugh to say, I'm a celibate monk. I'm the last person on the world to offer advice. You know much more about raising children than I ever will. And then he'll often, people will say, how can we bring peace to Tibet? And he'll say, look, I've got a really bad stomachache now. If I were all powerful, I'd get rid of my stomachache. We're all in the middle of suffering, and suffering is non-negotiable and an equal opportunity employer in some ways. So you're absolutely right. He's very good at bringing people back down to earth. And also, if I had to describe him in one word, it would be realist. Precisely because, or partly because, for 84 years, he's been leader of his people. So he's in no position to entertain romantic or abstract or wishy-washy ideas. He has to be in the middle of the real. And I think that's his gift to the world, that he hasn't been on a mountaintop or sequestered in a monastery. He's in Times Square. He's on the streets of Calcutta. He's in the European Parliament, in the middle of some of these seemingly insoluble problems.
You described the Dalai Lama as the warmest, kindest, most gracious person that you know, and the second such person was Leonard Cohen, who you were associated with for decades, and he was your first experience in Zen. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, not quite my first, but you're absolutely right. And, I never forget that day, late in December, midwinter, 1995. I drove up into the high, cold, dark mountains behind Los Angeles. And I pulled off into a parking lot. It was almost snow on the ground. And there was this old, stooped figure, a tattered black gown with a bobble cap and gold rimmed glasses. I got out of my car and he gave me a deep bow, though I'd never met this guy before. And then he insisted on carrying my suitcases into the little cabin in which I was to stay for the next 4 days. And then as soon as we got to the cabin, he started heating up vegetables and making tea for me. And until he turned around and he said, "Would you like a wife too?" I didn't realize that this tattered old monk was Leonard Cohen, who'd been my hero already for 21 years, but who had come to live as a full-time monk at the Mount Baldy Center, partly to erase the notion of Leonard Cohen. And what was so moving to me was to see this man of 61, who could have been anywhere in the world with anyone, doing anything he chose, giving himself over to this backbreaking discipline. Just all his days for 5.5 years were spent scrubbing floors, shoveling snow, and especially cooking for and tending to the old Japanese head of the center, Joshu Sasaki Roshi, or driving Sasaki Roshi to the doctor. And as most people know, Leonard Cohen did come back into Los Angeles after his 5.5 years as a monk. And I would often visit him in the modest house in a beat-up part of LA he shared with his daughter and later with a grandson. And whenever I arrived or anybody arrived, he would be standing outside the door, just like an anonymous grunt waiting to serve. And as soon as you arrive, he would cook up scrambled eggs or heat up some bagels for you. I'm just tend to you. Absolutely. That became his main reflex. And I remember one time I was having lunch with him there, and he played for me the record he was about to bring out called Popular Problems. There's a title only Leonard Cohen would love, Popular Problems. And his teacher, Sasaki Roshi, couldn't join us for the lunch because he was in hospital at that time. And in fact, as it would transpire, he would die the next day at the age of 107. And Leonard said to me, and most of our conversation was about his teacher. They were together more than 45 years. The teacher spoke limited English. Leonard, I think, spoke no Japanese. They communicated beautifully. I mean, they were best friends. And in the teacher, he found somebody who would forgive everything he'd done and not even care about what he had done. But Leonard would speak with such exalted intensity about Sasaki Roshi. And on this occasion, as his teacher was in hospital, he said, it's the same thing that my Benedictine prior said, and the same thing all of you know already. He said, that's what this whole practice is about. It's about sitting in the hospital day after night and day after night when your friend is in trouble. And it's about cleaning his bottom when he can't take care of himself. And it's about changing his diapers. An elegant and impeccable Leonard was the one who was there in the hospital doing all of that with Sasaki Roshi. And I think one important thing, I mean, many charges were brought against Sasaki Roshi, and to some extent he died shrouded in a certain degree of scandal. And when Leonard would talk about him, he was wise to all his teachers or his spiritual friends' imperfections and deficiencies. But he said it's like Mozart. And this goes back to talking about creativity, John. And he said, of course, this guy is a flawed mortal human being, and he does lots of things that nobody would approve of. But as with Mozart, things come through him that seem to partake of the divine. He is a vessel for something extraordinary that he, Leonard Cohen, had never heard in his many travels around the world. And in much the same way, many of us would not necessarily want to be a friend of Mozart and wouldn't necessarily take Mozart to be a moral teacher, but none of that changes the fact that Mozart had a rare gift for channeling, so to speak, certain creative forces that could be illuminating to many people. And I think that's how Leonard spoke very beautifully about his teacher. So as a model of devotion, as well as a model of attention, it was really humbling to be with Leonard.
Yeah, that's such a great story. Hallelujah. The best out there. You know, we have quite a bit of time left, and I want to open it up to John Tarrant and Allison Atwell, who know Pico very well, and we all joined in lunch in May, and then since then, and I just love to hear from them and what see if they have any questions. And then, should anybody have in the audience have some questions, just send a chat, and we'll look at it on the margin, and possibly we can get to those questions.
Thanks, John. Hi, Pico.
Hey, John. Good to see you.
I don't know. I've just been taking the ride here, and like having wonderful times. So the questions, there must be questions. I love the thing about finding the place to find peace is not getting away from the turmoil that's going to be in the midst of the conflict and the desire and sorrow and all that, you know. And I think that might be why I ended up in Zen, and I do think the Tibetans are very strong on that too. And there are people, as you pointed out, wonderful Catholic contemplators, and I think that the thing that you don't get on board something to believe, you know, and I'm sort of I'm always kind of thrilled with that, you know. And it doesn't mean you don't have a spiritual feeling, but it seems important. As soon as I start getting on board something to believe, then I start arguing with myself as well as other people, and there's that. So the other thing I think I haven't really touched, well, there's a couple of things. One of them I'll ask later, but you're touched by the people, the reaching, people aspiring, people longing for something. It's almost as if the longing itself is a spiritual movement, and it's not about what you said about Bali really struck me, because I know people who just go to Bali and they think they're on Prosperous Island and so on. And maybe they are, actually. Yeah, you pointed out. Maybe they are. It's a stranger place than they thought. But the thing about it's you're always trying to achieve something, but it's the walking of the path that seems so important. So anyway, you seem to be someone with a great feel for that. So and if you have anything to say about that.
Well, I mean, as always, I love what you say, and exactly right. I don't share the beliefs of my Catholic friends, but it's their actions that move me and instruct me. And I think they're wise enough to see that the belief is really beside the point, or the least significant part of the equation, which is why I'd say maybe almost the majority of the people staying there are Buddhist or Sufi or nothing at all. And they know that whoever goes there will find what she is looking for. And what you said is exactly perfect, because I was talking to the prior recently for my book, and he said, you know, people all often say being a monk is a preparation for death. And of course, we have to spend more time thinking about death than the average person on the streets might. But I adamantly believe it's a preparation for life. And then he said, it's the longing that's the ecstasy. I mean, word for word, what you just said,
nice.
John. So yes, and just a reminder that what they're doing, they're walking along the same path as you and finding exactly the same thing. And actually, when I was talking about the joy of not knowing, I think I remember actually reading in one of your books years ago, something like, if I find what I'm not looking for, I become unknown even to myself. And what a blessing that is, to become unknown even to oneself. I think that's sort of why one goes on retreat, or why one puts oneself in the middle of turmoil in Sri Lanka, to be uprooted from one's small notion of who one is, and be part of that vast whatever. Yes, you expressed exactly, I think, what my Benedictine friends would say.
And there's something about in Zen, you know, on the aspirational thing, there's a famous koan where somebody says, a little story where somebody says to Yun Men, a great Chinese teacher, says, I'm reaching for the light, please help me. And he says, forget about the light, give me the reaching. It seems like, anyway, that's something you have a real feel for in all those places in this book that in other writings of yours too. But
Yeah, and it's often about reaching for the dark too, of course,
well,
rather than
absolutely.
turning away from the dark. Exactly so. And I've always imagined, not knowing much about it, that that's part of what koan's study is about, which is to say, it's like poetry. It's opening you up rather than closing you down, and it's not about coming to an answer, but it's about expanding you to this huge stuff around, and just opening doors to remind you how much is out there or isn't out there. But yes, I like the reaching for the light, and I sometimes even don't even have to reach for it. I mean, as I was saying to John with creativity, it's almost about putting yourself in a place where the light can find you, which isn't always the place where we happen to be. In other words, that's why I turn off the freeway and drive up the mountain to that place, because the light is probably finding me in the freeway, but I'm not in a position to receive it or to sift it out from everything around me. But once I clear myself from the clutter, then I can see it.
There's something else. I think your book is really talking about this, because you have a great respect for lots of different traditions, and definitely take sides on things, and and have lots of wild opinions. But you and I was thinking about the creative way, the way you write. In this context, I was thinking about the way you write, that your writing is what other people would call a practice, as in something that changes you and through which you discover things that you were not expecting to discover. And I think the essence of Zen in some ways is finding things that you want, finding things in your own heart and mind that you didn't know about and you weren't looking for. And your tremendous discipline seems to go in that direction. Yes.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I would agree with you in the sense that I've never had a meditation practice. But if my wife were here now and you met her in July, she would say, all this guy ever does is sit still for 8 hours a day, trying to cut through his projections and illusions and see what's on the far side of his thoughts. And he needs to be out in the world a lot more. He's spending too much time sitting on a metaphorical cushion. So again, and this probably, you must be all familiar with this a lot. When I was in New York City, I thought, well, I will go to a Zen temple in Kyoto because that's a place where I can sit calmly meditating for hours a day. And of course, Zen temple in Kyoto, like the place where Leonard Cohen is all about hard work and scrubbing the floors and raking the leaves and taking care of everybody else. So it wasn't at all what I romantically conceived, but what I really was reaching for, the light I was reaching for in that instance was the writing practice, and I misnamed it and misidentified it in my youth. But I suppose the hope was that what I would find in writing is faintly equivalent as a sort of beginner's version of what all of you find in the Zendo. And to that extent, I said to John 2 weeks ago that what comes out of the desk is immaterial. It doesn't matter if it makes sense to anybody else. It's the fact of sitting there day after day that the discipline that you suggest, that's a blessing. Funnily enough, just I think 2 days ago, I was reading Martin Scorsese was talking about his meditation practice, and he found it indistinguishable from filmmaking because it's in both cases exactly the same. You go there, sit there, try day after day after day, and every other day nothing happens, or you seem to be going backwards, and some other days good things happen, and the only point of either practice is you just put in the time day after day after day, confident that actually none of the time is going to be wasted. And even the days that are in infuriation, in some invisible way, might be helping you deal with the suffering of the world.
Yeah, that's beautiful. The practice really is in the world. That it can be in the monastery, but it is in the world. Yeah. The final thing I think that really struck me was that your willingness to put yourself in danger to, in a way, commune with and find out what was in the heart of, some places and some the place in Iran, and I think also in Northern Australia. I think there was reason to be afraid, and up in Broome, and but in Iran, where as long as nobody knew who you were okay. But and there's something about sort of being in the midst of this tremendous human longing and longing to belong and longing to have everybody be the same and longing and a sort of almost transcendent longing to merge together. That you and it just struck me how willing you are to experience all the different varieties of that kind of yearning and difficulty, but you experience them in what we would think of as a Zen way, where you get immersed in it. You don't stand outside and explain it and watch it, things like that. So I don't know if you have anything to say about that, but there's something I was very struck by in this book.
Oh, well, thank you, and thank you for reading the book with such attention. A part of me feels that danger and safety are just projections, that they're illusions in the head. And, so if I say I'm going to Iran or North Korea, some of my neighbors in California will say, that's really scary. And as you know, almost anywhere in the world, the scary places are Los Angeles and New York, as far as most people are concerned. What is danger? I remember when I began my writing life in my mid-20s, I was spending a lot of time. I spent time in Central America when it was in the middle of war, in the Philippines as they were going through the toppling of Ferdinand Marcos, and in Cuba constantly in the late 1980s. Nothing bad ever happened to me. Then I come back to Santa Barbara, one of the most affluent, gated, protected places on earth, and my house burns down with me standing in the middle of it for 3 hours. And I thought it was a very useful liberation at that early stage in life. You're never safe. And danger really has to do with the fact that you don't know these places. No, very few of my friends go to North Korea, so to them it's the great unknown, it's the great terror. And anybody who's been will say it's a strange place that they wouldn't necessarily want to live in, but terror is not the first thing that comes to mind. And the same in reverse. People who've never been to New York City would find it terrifying. People who've been there know how to navigate it. So, and in the time when I'm in Santa Barbara, sad to say, quite often there's a mass murder or another fire or whatever, and suddenly Santa Barbara has a murder rate higher than that of San Salvador or Beirut. So yeah, it's a funny thing. I've been working in the mainstream media for 41 years, and the main thing I've learned from it, never to trust the mainstream media, which, and I think it's in the job of planting the illusion of danger and associating it with the other, whatever it is. In Iran, they're probably told that Los Angeles is the worst place in the world, and in Los Angeles, they're probably told Tehran is the worst place in the world. But by not being affiliated to either position, the hope is that you're not prey to either illusion.
Well, thank you. That's wonderful. I think I should step aside now. I think Alison wants to have at you too. So
good. She has many questions, I think.
She's the person who read the it's like one of those Bibles that has errors in it, and where they said thou shalt not do something, but they dropped the not or something. She found this Karate Kid version, bits of the Karate Kid story were in your books. She was thrilled, and we were all thrilled, and we were reading it to each other. Suddenly, you're writing you're in Jerusalem, and you're writing film scripts. Anyway,
yes, for those, by the way, who don't understand, John wasn't speaking metaphorically. There was a printing error with this book, and so literally at 3 pages in the book, suddenly excerpts from the recently published memoir of Ralph Macchio, the Karate Kid, appear in my book, and maybe my hallowed script appears in his autobiography too. Oh, I'm not hearing you, Alison. Could you unmute, I think?
There we go. I highly recommend that version if anyone can get it. It's a collector's item. It just does amazing things to the whole book. I really loved it. Let's see. I guess I'll start in that summer of 1989, I believe it was in July, when the Painted Cave fire tore through that area of Santa Barbara. I was at Hendry's Beach in Santa Barbara with my husband and my 6-year-old daughter, and it was so hot, and so the whole beach was crowded with people, and all of a sudden over the cliffs comes this huge, almost like a mushroom cloud of smoke going straight up in the sky, and then within minutes, the whole beach was being rained on with dinner plate size pieces of ash, which I'm pretty sure was your book. It was falling on.
Raining blessings upon you.
Yes. So I was also struck by in your book how you placed yourself repeatedly, not just once or twice, but over and over again, right in the center of this quality of mind of intractable and defended and a certainty, with which then required an aggression that became visible in the world to maintain. And in fact, it rises out of that cast of mind. And we just came out, Jon Joseph and John Tarrant and I, from a week-long of Sesshin in meditation retreat, and meeting with my own mind and with the mind of the participants of the retreat in interviews, that cast of mind, and there's an inner Belfast in each person. There's an inner Jerusalem, and that the kind of courage it takes for an individual to actually stay with the conflict without doing anything about it, but to feel what it's like to live in that world. I was so struck by your encounters out in the physical world, was so incredibly sympathetic to the inner work. So do you want to say anything about that before I ask one of my other questions?
Well, I mean, so beautifully and eloquently put again. Thank you. That's a high compliment. And of course, you noticed almost the kicker, this main sentence in the book is at the very end from Edo Roshi, the Zen teacher, saying, your struggle is your paradise. That's where you've got to find it. Yes, I was going to, well, conveniently for all of us, I think by going off to Edo Roshi, I've forgotten what I was going to say in response to your question. It will come back to me in a minute, because I did have something to say about yeah, it will let it come back to me. And you can ask your next question, and it'll jog me into remembering what I was going to say.
Right. The other thing I was very struck by was how I think on a number of occasions I've heard you describe your relationship with formal meditation, that you, well, clearly, traveling with the Dalai Lama, and even being in the monastery up in California, that you're with people who are involved in a formal meditation practice. But I was, and so there, on one side, you have saying that you don't do that. So I was curious, I have a two-part question. I was curious what you imagine that to be that's not what you're doing. And then what you imagine they're doing that you're not. And then also my question is, in your book, you describe this marvelous scene in Jerusalem where you go into this place where I guess the tomb of Jesus, they think is, yeah. And there's all these crowds, all this noise and chaos. And you find this side area, which is just a cave. There's no one in it. And there's only one candle, which seemed, and some kind of quiet, unobtrusive space with which you are drawn to. And you something's happening there in your own heart and mind. And that so much so that you come back there more than once. Yes. So my two-part question is, what do you think that meditation is, you're not doing? And then what was happening inside you there in the cave?
such too deep and too searching a question, or double question. Thank you, Alison. And luckily, I do remember what I was going to say to the previous question too. So the quick answer to, I love that question, which of course I've never addressed before. What do I imagine people are finding in the Zendo that I don't find at the writing desk? And I think the answer is in what Jon said a few minutes ago, the word he used being discipline in the time. So I have been in Zendo, and I used to teach every summer a workshop at Tassajara with a close friend of mine who's the Zen abbess at San Francisco Zen Center, Fu Schrader, and I'm actually doing a book with her, I hope, of our conversations. And so every day would begin in the Zendo.
Pico, you seem to have frozen. Let me see if we. You there, Pico?
Oh, I really wanted to hear the answer to that.
Yeah. I hope we get it. Pico. Oh, we lost him. He'll come back on right away. But let me see. I could sing a song, or
I think it's fine. This is our practice.
yeah,
Waiting for
yeah.
Pico.
Ring the bell. You could sit until he comes back.
Let's just sit. Yeah, let's sit. See if he can come back. Not back yet. I can answer a few of the questions we have, though. What does the calligraphy on his wall say? It says Manbutsu, or 10,000 things, which is, of course, the 10,000 things of Zen, the universe. What is the name of the book? The book is called The Half-Known Life in Search of Paradise. Half-Known Life in Search of Paradise. And Pico Iyer, message from Pico Iyer, and no, I don't see it. And your writing on Merton's transmission in Sri Lanka is haunting. What was your experience of being with those extraordinary Buddhas? Thanks for your wise and eloquent talk. Yeah, it was beautiful and hilarious, really, him going up the mountain. He says he's only afraid of two things. One is heights and snakes, and he found both of them on the mountain.
Pico's in, John. Pico's in. Yeah.
Oh, good, good.
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me and see me now?
We can do both. Well done.
Excellent. Good. So thank you, John. Sorry about that. This is the first time my internet's cut out. So I will continue my answer to Alison's question. So a monk in the book that I'm just about to finish says at one point, the beauty of this practice is that once you've done it for 3 hours meditating, and you're still not where you need to be, there are another 4 hours to come. And it just gave me a sense of what I experienced at the desk, which is you need these large passages of time, and you need more the commitment to give yourself over to that. So that's the difference between a Zen practitioner and myself. I've chosen to do it at desk, and they at the Zendo. I think a Zen practitioner who's written, and for example, John Tarrant is an example, would be better qualified to say what's the difference between those two practices. And then 2 more. I have to answer 2 more questions in terms of the worship in Jerusalem. Thank you for alighting upon that moment. And I think what struck me, and the reason that it's the center of the book in certain ways, is, as you said, it's this broken little empty space, a cave almost, with just a little shelf and a guttering candle, as you said, far from the crowds. And it moves me almost to tears. And I'm not a Christian. And again, as you said, every morning in the pre-dawn dark, I would walk over the uneven stones of Jerusalem to find my way magnetically to that space. And every evening at dusk, as the bells above me would be chiming in sync, I would find myself there. And I remember at one point, I saw a young woman walking past, probably 13, 14 years old, and she just looked at this empty space, probably didn't notice me, and broke into tears. And it was a wonderful reminder that you don't have to go to the Taj Mahal or St. Peter's or wherever it might be to find the dazzle of light. It's there whenever you're ready for it, or if only you have the eyes for it. And I think that brings me back to what I forgot to say in answer to your previous question, which is, I do believe that travel is a fool's paradise, as Emerson said. If you think you can get anything, find anything in Tibet or Lourdes, you couldn't find at home. But the beauty of travel for me is that you're taking nothing for granted, and that you're opening your eyes to the world, I find, in a way you don't when you're at home. When I'm going through the motions in the place I think of as home, I'm sleepwalking through my day. And I'm also imagining I have to be somewhere at 2 p.m. And I've got in my head a sense of how I want the day to proceed and how I expect it to unfold. As soon as I'm loose in those places you were describing, I don't know what's going to happen. And I'm wide open, and I've gone there with a view to open myself to it. So it's nice of you to refer to courage there. It's a choice, because I spent too much of my life sleepwalking. And I think the more important message is that I find if I'm walking down the street in Santa Barbara and somebody comes up to me, as he usually will, with a hand extended, an unhoused or homeless person, I'll probably walk past. I'm sorry, I have to be somewhere at 3 o'clock. I'm locked inside my own agenda and schedule. I have no time for you. When I'm in Port-au-Prince in Haiti or in Calcutta, and I walk down the road and somebody comes up to me, I can give myself entirely to that person and to the situation they're bringing into my life and the question they're asking. And I'm very grateful if travel, by freeing me from the illusion that I know how my days are going to go, allows me to give myself more fully to everything around me. So I do put myself in places that are as different as possible from the ones I know. And I don't, it's nice to think of it as bravery, but I think it's also just, that's what I'm there for, to see the things that are happening all around me in California or Japan, but I don't attend to.
I was very struck by actually a felt sense of refuge that I felt as the reader when you came to that cave, and also it seems to correspond to what you were describing about your first time to the monastery, and how you suddenly the old Pico became very small and the world became very large, would be the corresponding image to that felt sense of refuge.
Beautiful. And refuge is a wonderful word. I mean, I refer to my hermitage as sanctuary, basically exactly the same thing. And I'd never thought of it, but you're absolutely right. And the beauty of it is it's completely mysterious. The way in a crowded room, you'll see somebody and you feel you know that person better than you know your friends and family. And that's the experience most of us has with different places. For no good reason, somewhere in the world that is completely unexceptional goes right through us. And we feel a sense of recognition. And in my case, when I first came to Japan, I felt if I don't come here full time, I will be an exile for life. This place understands me, and I have some connection with it that needs to be deepened. And maybe that's exactly what I felt, as you say, at the Hermitage and in that little nondescript cave on the wrong side of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And I think everybody listening to this conversation has met such places. The grace of the modern world is sometimes one actually gets to live there thanks to technology. And so I felt so grateful that I could spend most of my life in Japan, where I felt an instant sense of familiarity. And I'm also so grateful that I can go back to that monastery and even occasionally to Jerusalem. That refuge is a beautiful word, because what I find, so every time I drive up to the Hermitage, and again, all of you know the equivalent in your own lives, maybe when you're going to Sesshin or to Zendo, on the way up, I'm just playing the same routines I'm always playing in my head. You know, I'm quarreling with an editor and I'm fretting about some deadline. And I'm worried about how will my poor mother get by for 72 whole hours in my absence. And as soon as I step into that room, all of that falls away. And I see how immaterial it is. And suddenly, even mortality doesn't seem so frightening to me. So I guess you're right that there's some pervading sense of safety that has to do maybe with a taste or an experience of something that feels beyond the world of change. And I don't know if it is or not, but I have that illusion, that sensation. This is something that's always going to be there. So I remember when important people in my life have died, it tends to be a very, very busy time in the immediate wake of their death, organizing the memorial, writing the obituary, tending to people at the door and condolence letters. But right in the middle of that, I will drive 3.5 hours north and just sit on a bench in the monastery for 2 hours and then drive back down. And it's to clear my head. And it's probably, as you say, for a sense of refuge, but it's also for a reminder that something essential in the world doesn't die. And that maybe the best in people who we have lost is still there. And so insofar as our lives are so finite, the greatest grace can be to sense something that feels wider than that finitude. And I hadn't thought of the word safe, but you're absolutely right. I'm less threatened by death and impermanence when I go there than I would be the rest of the time. And I go there to put things in proportion and to come to my senses and to remind myself that I don't have to be scared about the end of things, because it's not an end.
I heard you quote something about, you said something about Emily Dickinson, and it reminds me of like the difference between a religion based on certainty, which is defended and full of conflict, and looking for answers. And you said she wasn't looking for certainty. She was catching glimpses of light.
Yes, and then I think right after that, I quote her wonderful line, something like, wonder means not exactly knowing and not exactly not knowing, something like that. And of course, in my coming book on the monks, Emily Dickinson is really at the center of things as a reminder you don't have to be in a cloister to be on intimate terms with death and life and light and many other things. So she, by not leaving her room for 26 years, gave as deep an accounting of those spaces as anyone I'm aware of. And again, it's a reminder almost of what Jon was saying, the belief part, the cloister part, the doctrine part is immaterial. It's the least of it. It's just, yeah, maybe what you and Jon, what you, Alison, and Jon said earlier about sitting still with the conflict zones of the heart and the mind. And she did that, and by virtue of doing that, she found that place beyond all certainties, as you say, and beyond the need for knowing. And so, and you're absolutely right. My book is about freeing oneself from certainties, freeing oneself from conclusions, and freeing oneself from the way that knowledge hems us in. It's the opposite of a refuge. It's like a fortress behind which we hide, telling ourselves, I know these facts, or I'm certain of these beliefs, when everything around may be a forest fire or a hurricane or a flood that's far greater than our thoughts about it.
Thank you all. I think I've taken up a lot of your time. And
No, I really apologize for the wonderful thing about Safe Japan is the internet never goes out, and it just did. So I'm sorry for that hiatus, but Jon was filling it in very well, I think, by talking about Thomas Merton and the Buddhas in Sri Lanka. Is that right? Is that what you were?
Right. Allison, are you good or anymore?
I'm finished, yeah.
Okay. Let's just address that one question. Your writing on Merton's transformation of Sri Lanka is haunting. What was your experience of being with those extraordinary Buddhas? And thanks for your wise and eloquent talk.
Well, thank you for such kind words. And I'm afraid I got very little out of the Buddhas, which is a perfect example of what I was about to say a minute ago, which is how arbitrary the chemistry between a person and another person, or a person and a place, always is, which is why I never tell people to go to my particular monastery, because it probably won't agree with them in every sense of the word. I do tell them to try to seek out a place where they can find stillness or be freed from distraction and clutter a little bit. And it's interesting because when I first, so to speak, discovered my hermitage, I started visiting other Christian Catholic places around the world, in Western Australia, in England, my home country, all kinds of other places. And they were all pleasant, and the silence was always welcome. But I never felt transport in the way I did in my particular place. Which was very, very useful reminder that, the answer doesn't lie in one book, nor does the answer lie in one location or one tradition or anything. And as we've been saying, I think throughout these 90 minutes, one can forget about answers entirely. That's probably why you live with koan. That's why you live with the koan of everybody else and the koan of life. So, I don't want to be attached to particulars in any way. And in the book that I just finished, as I think Jon and Allison and Jon Joseph all intuited, each of those places is really a parable. You're not going to learn much about Iran or Kashmir or Sri Lanka or Jerusalem from my book, but each one is a way of addressing a question that all of us entertains at home. But at home, it's so easy to look past the question. And by going to a place that's externally exotic and tangibly unknowable, suddenly you can look at the question more directly than you might otherwise. So each of them is asking me something that I never hope to answer.
That's wonderful, wonderful. Well, with that, Pico, unless there's other questions, let's wrap it up here. It's been so nice to share in your graciousness and your generosity. And I have to say, you're so responsive in terms of inquiries and needs. And I really, really appreciate that. And I look forward to us continuing this conversation with many people in many places in the future. And it's wonderful to have you here tonight. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Jon, and thank both Jons and Allison for taking the time and trouble to read my book and read it so carefully and respond to it so deeply. So the beauty of this session for me is I'm going to be thinking about the questions you've been asking me for probably the next many days to come. So thank you for all you do. And one day I hope I'll be able to turn the questions on you, especially that wonderful question about what is the difference between sitting in a zendo and sitting in a desk. Thank you all.
Thank you, Pico. Good night, all. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much, Jon and Allison. Lovely, lovely.
Thanks, Jon. Splendid. Thank you.